To say I'm so thankful to have all of you here, especially our visitors. So good to have the Mars and the Clarks with us, and those little kids just getting bigger and bigger every time we see them. So glad to have you with us. This morning we're going to talk about our marriage series. We're starting to wrap this up. But there's a couple more lessons I want to cover with you as we talk about trying to improve our marriages through better communication, through the language of love and respect. There is a lesson that he gives in the book that I wanted to talk with you about. But I want to say one of the I think, good things about doing a series, usually about once a month, is that it reminds us that, as we often hear those who have been married for a while talk to those who are young in life, that marriage is great. It is wonderful, but, there's that but, it takes a lot of work. And it's real easy for us to get into a groove, maybe a bad groove, to get into some bad habits and just kind of go along with that. And I hope, if nothing else, that these lessons will help us to just kind of remind ourselves that we just need to keep working to keep those marriages on what we call the energizing cycle. So in this morning's lesson, we're going to go back a little bit towards the beginning of our series and hammer something a little bit deeper that we started talking about towards the beginning of this series. We talked about that usually marriages can be in one or two cycles. And what we're really doing here is we're just taking these biblical passages, some of them dealing directly with marriage, some of them not, and just giving a practical way of working on these things in your marriage. But I say it's your choice. Sometimes marriages, again, like I say, get into a bad groove, and they spend a lot of time in what Dr. Ingres calls that crazy cycle. And marriages don't do well that stay in the crazy cycle. But it's our choice. We can do the hard stuff, as we talked about in our last lesson, and we can try to stay on the energizing cycle. Now, having said that, I understand that there are going to be times, even as you're working on this, even as you're trying as hard as you can to be on that energizing cycle, there's going to be times where you fall off. It just happens, right? No one is perfect. But what we're trying to do here is give you a set of practical tools that demonstrate what God talks about as far as the Christian life and the Christian marriage, so that we can minimize our time on the crazy cycle and lengthen our time on the energizing cycle. Something to help us to be more mindful about the way we treat our spouse. So our main passage this morning is going to be in 1 Peter chapter 3. If you would turn with me to 1 Peter chapter 3. It's really the passage that really focuses on what we want to talk about, one of the challenges in marriage. And so in 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter starts with the wives, and we're going to do that as well this morning. He says, "In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior." I want to stop there just for a second. Wives out there, I just want to call your attention, just have you to remember. Peter says that a wife has the ability to win over her husband without a word, without speaking a word. Instead, winning over her husband by her actions. In verse 4, he says, "But let it be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. Throughout this series, we have talked about things that may not come natural to us sometimes, that are hard, that may not be at the time emotionally pleasing. And this is one of those things we're going to talk about. But I want to call your attention that this won't be easy. One of the things we're going to talk about this morning is that women love to and need to talk and do a lot of talking. And sometimes that brings some challenges to the husband and wife relationship. But let's continue on. He says that in verse 5, for in this way, former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. Just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right, without being frightened by any fear. And now he addresses the husbands. And you husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. Husbands out there, we need to pay attention. I want you to just kind of latch on that Peter, by inspiration, says that we are to live with our wives in an understanding way, and that we are to grant her grace as a fellow heir. Okay? Oftentimes in marriages, we know the right thing to do, but we're waiting for our spouse to do it first. If they do it first, then that will motivate us to do it. And the whole thing about this, husbands, is that if we're waiting for our wife to do the right thing, that may never come. That may destroy our marriages. But we have to take that first step sometimes. And so the goal is not to wait for your spouse to do what we're talking about in this series. The goal is for us, even if it's tough, even if it's emotionally difficult, for us to do what God wants us to do in our marriage. And what we find is that sometimes the hard thing isn't so hard. And sometimes what we find is the more that we do the hard thing, the easier it becomes and the more common it becomes. And what we find out is that we energize our spouse. And as we energize our spouse, we in turn are energized. And so Peter gives us a wonderful recipe to having a successful, energizing marriage, just like you see this young couple up on the screen. They are very much energized. And then in verse 8 and 9 he says, let me sum all this up. All of you be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. As we talked about last time, oftentimes verse 8 and 9 is exactly how marriages end up. Insult for insult. Rebuke for rebuke. He says that's not the way it's supposed to be. But someone has to take that first step. And so, as we talked about in the very beginning, no shock to us, though kind of a shock to the world as the world continues to try to minimize the differences between men and women, where God emphasizes the difference and says it's for our good. But even though it's for our good, it can present some challenges in marriage and in communication. And so we're going to emphasize that men and women are different, and we have to realize that. And if you don't believe me that they're different, they think differently, they communicate differently, just play some Pictionary with them. I remember a time where a bunch of us couples got together and we decided to play Pictionary. Then they decided, let's do men versus women. Well, men, let me tell you, there might be some games that you can do that and win. Pictionary is not one of them. Women have this way that no matter what they draw, they're is so in tune, they can get it. Case in point. One of the ladies got up, grabbed the card, looked at the card, said, okay, started drawing. To the best of my recollection, she drew something like this. Within 5 seconds, the ladies had it. Boom. The guys looked at that and said, how'd you get that from that? Anybody want to guess what the answer was? I give you permission to speak out loud at this point. Nobody wants to be brave enough? Here's what the answer was. To me, it looks like a meat cleaver. Here's what the lady got within 5 seconds. Now the ladies are all like, yeah, I see that. The guys are still saying, what? Well, apparently in a woman's mind, this is what the United States of America looks like. This being Florida, of course. And this is where apparently New Orleans is, pretty close. Men and women are different. And we need to realize that. They communicate differently. They have different needs when it comes to communication. Well, a woman talks a lot more because there are certain things that she gets out of. She gets a lot more out of that communication than men do. And we need to understand that. They can get different things out of communication. And so wives, just because you get all of this from talking a lot does not mean your husband gets the same from talking and probably doesn't. And so we just need to remember this. And so what we're going to talk about this morning is something that is very, very challenging, that if we don't remember it, this is where we end up. The doghouse, right? And most often it is the man that ends up in the doghouse, but women can end up there too. But like I said, it's your choice. If you want to stay on the crazy cycle and stay in the doghouse, okay. But I'll tell you what, doing some of these more difficult things not only gets you out of the doghouse, but it energizes you, your spouse, your marriage. But there's going to be times like this. And so we're trying to minimize that. So there's one big difference when it comes to men and women and communication. Wives need and can talk more than men do. Now, I understand that we're generalizing here and that there probably are some exceptions to the rule, but by generic rule, that's true. Wives talk a lot more. Women talk a lot more than men and feel that need to. And so in his book, and this is a term he uses, not me, ladies, he talks about the talkative wife. And so we're going to talk about the talkative wife and some of the challenges that presents in marriage. Husbands don't need and usually don't enjoy talking much. Their discussions are much shorter, more direct. And so he also talks about the challenge of the quiet husband. And we're going to talk about that as well. You see, what often happens is couples start working on this language of love and respect, and they get this whole thing that he is supposed to communicate love to me. And so the wife's like, great, then I'm going to go to him and I'm going to talk and talk and talk and talk, and it's going to energize me, and he's got to show me love. And so he's going to listen and listen and listen and take it all in. And what happens? He doesn't. And so she's expecting to do something that's going to energize them, and it doesn't go well. And so her energy cycle starts slowing down. And if not careful, you can go from the energizing cycle to the crazy cycle. But wives say, well, isn't he supposed to show me love? And isn't he supposed to energize me? And you can see as you start working out this system of taking this practical approach to marriage, you could have that conflict. And so when wives talk, Dr. Ingrid says, they talk in what's called spider web. I'm familiar with the concept. I'm not familiar with the term. But he says one of the problems in marriage is, one of the challenges in communicating marriage is that women, when they speak, most often spiderweb. What does that mean? Well, men, we're always told by our women, right? Let's face it. Women like to say, well, we can multitask. We can do more than one thing at a time. You men can't. How many of us have heard that? Well, women then try to prove it by what he calls spider webbing. What is spider webbing? Well, spider webbing is when a wife jumps from one subject to another subject, never finishing the first topic, because one topic reminds them of another topic that she just has to talk about right then and right there. And so a conversation goes something like this. I'm going to try my best. But being a blue male, I'm not very good at this. She'll say, oh, honey, did you hear what happened at school today? And he'll say, no, what happened? Oh, well, they had an alarm, and Joey didn't take his jacket, and so he was out in the snow for like 25 minutes, and they were really cold until the alarm was over and got to go back. Oh, so he says there was a fire. Oh, no, it was a drill. But you know the teacher? Oh, I talked to the teacher. Did you know she's getting a divorce? Yeah. I heard that her and her husband aren't getting along very well. And, well, he started seeing someone. And, oh, that reminds me. I'm going to get my hair cut on Thursday. Is that okay? Can you pick up the kids Thursday afternoon? Because I'm going to get my hair cut. Oh, my hairstylist. Did you know what? She started dating this new guy. I think you know him. And it goes on something like that. Did I do okay? That's what happens. But what often happens is that the wife is spider webbing, going from here to here to here to here to here, thinking the guy is taking it all in, and then at some point, either at that point after the conversation, or usually a day, 2 days later, she says, don't you remember I told you such and such? And he's going, what? And then the wife says, you never listen. And there's that escalator word, never. And the husband's thinking, when did you say that? Well, you can imagine the trouble, the challenge, the crazy cycle that comes about. You see, men are more linear in their communication. And so often you have a process like this picture. Look at how energized she is. But he's just not getting it. He is just overloaded, right? Men are more linear in communication. And so it's like, well, the best thing I can think of is the men's business meeting. Women are probably glad they're not in there, right? Men business meeting. Well, we have a schedule, and we start with topic number 1. And we talk about topic number 1. Okay, we're going to do that. All right, that one's concluded. And then we go to topic number 2. Okay, that one's done. Topic number 3. And you know what? Sometimes there's like a topic on the schedule that we skip over sometimes because we thought it was complete. And somebody will say, wait a second, we got to go back because we missed number 3. That's how we talk. That's how we communicate. Men and women are different. And so the talkative wife. Wives often feel that if their husband really loved them, they would try to talk and, more importantly, listen more. He's supposed to energize me. When that doesn't happen, they get upset. You see, a wife feels energized when she talks. When her husband doesn't want to talk that much, her energizing cycle begins to slow down and can even stop. Is it real? It's real, isn't it? Should a husband be forced to talk and listen to the spider web? Dr. Ingrid says no. One, because as hard as he tries, he's not going to get all of that. And that's the funny thing. A wife could do that to her best friend, spider web all over the place, and that girlfriend can repeat back everything she said. Guys, like there was a fire at school. So 1 Peter chapter 3, 1, verse 4, this is why we emphasize this. There is in the Bible this idea that less words, thought out words, more planned words is actually better. And in fact, Peter says at some point women can make a very powerful impact on an unbelieving husband, not with the words, but by a gentle and quiet spirit. The Bible even has this idea that sometimes women need to talk less, not more. It's more helpful to talk less than more, but I know it's a challenge. The way we would tackle it is we would tackle it wise by words, wouldn't we? Matthew 12, 36 and 37. And I say to you that every careless word that men shall speak, they shall render account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you shall be justified, and by your words we shall be condemned. We live in a society that has been taught that when you think it, say it. Whatever you think, say. Just talk, talk, talk. But the Bible presents that as a Christian, we need to be very careful with our words. In fact, a lot of these passages you look at, I don't even know how you would start off, at least, without just being deliberate. Stop. Think about what I want to say. Think about my words. Let's take a look at Ephesians 4, verse 29. Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word is good for edification according to the need of the moment, that it may give grace to those who hear. I don't know how you do that without stopping and thinking about it. Be more deliberate. I got to choose words that edify. Words that are needed in the moment. And so the Bible does paint this picture of more deliberate conversation. More thought out conversation. Is it easy at first? It's not. None of this is. But the more you do it, the more it becomes natural for you. So don't force your husband to talk and talk and talk and listen, listen, listen. And not only that, but sometimes we run into problems that maybe our talk isn't so spider web, but it's the time. Sometimes wives, and men can be this way as well, that as soon as a thought pops up in our mind, maybe we remember something, maybe it's right there, and we like, well, I got to tell him right now. Well, it could be that your husband is watching TV. He's watching the football game. And you might say, well, football's not that important to me. This should be more important, and so I'll interrupt him. Well, again, it's one of those things that just because it's not important to you doesn't mean it's not important to him. And husbands, that logic goes the other way as well. And so oftentimes a wife will be, I just got to tell him right now, and she'll interrupt him. And of course, he's not going to get it all. His focus is on something else. So sometimes it behooves us as wives, even as husbands, to maybe wait. Or maybe just very quickly, I need to talk to you about something, so when you have time. And at that point, you're going to get much more of your husband's full attention than divided attention. So give him a measure of grace when he doesn't listen and talk. Realize this is not natural for him. And maybe find another way to communicate what you want. And women, if you need a spider web, Dr. English, no problem with that. He said, no problem. Just do it with your girlfriends. Get all that out. Talk to them on the phone. Go out to coffee. But take a different approach with your husband. Ephesians 4, verse 2, what if we looked at it in this way? What would happen during times of misunderstanding where you and your husband are not connecting? Times of misunderstanding. What would happen if you responded this way? Ephesians 4, verse 2. With all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing forbearance to one another in love. I love putting passages like that. What if this was happening and you responded this way? Well, I would imagine that's going to have a much better result than lashing out or being angry or saying, you never listen. Ecclesiastes 6, verse 11, for there are many words which increases futility. Let's talk, as we close, about the quiet husband. Right? Husband, I don't want you to think that you're sitting there and it's like, man, preacher really got it this morning. He's really preaching it. I hope my wife's listening. Husbands, you're not off the hook, right? Just because we're saying don't spider web to your husband, we're not saying don't communicate to him. Husbands need to do that which energizes their wives. And so, husbands, you need to find a way where you can be a better listener. And you can energize your wife, fulfilling her needs, not yours, through communication. There needs to be a give and take there. In 1 Peter 3, verse 7, you husbands likewise live with your wives in an understanding way as with a weaker vessel. He goes on to say, because she's a woman. And I can see a lot of people taking offense at that. But there's a lot of views about this weaker vessel and why he says because she's a woman. To me, to say because she is physically weaker, and that's why you have to be more understanding with her, doesn't make much sense. I think it goes back to verse 1 where he says, wives, your role is to be submissive. And so, in practical terms, if a husband wants to be a thug, that's not what God wants. But if he says, hey, this is what we're going to do, she's got to be submissive to it. That's a weaker position. That's a position that needs a husband to have understanding. And what else? Give her grace. To me, that's what he's talking about. Don't be a thug. Don't be I'm the man of the house, so this is the way it's going to be. Give her understanding. Listen to her. Consider her wisdom. Consider her needs as well. And so this very passage talks about husbands doing what they can to what? Lift up their wives. Not as a weaker heir, but as a fellow heir of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And so you need to find a way, even in communication, to attend to your wife's needs and concerns. Realize that when she moves away and hardly talks to you, that's not a good thing. That shows that she's threatened, that she has some fear there. You need to address that. You probably are going to need to talk about it. The typical male neglects trying to understand and instead moves to do things that are more blue-like, more like a man. And that's what we're talking about. Sometimes men, just because that's what we typically do, that's why it's the easy thing to do, sometimes we got to be more deliberate and say, I got to put the brakes on that, and I need to go and be more pink to my wife. I need to communicate more on her terms, not mine. Sometimes when husbands listen, they listen with the wrong motives. And so we ask you, are you listening to your wife to be heard or to be understood? Right? One of those leads to the crazy cycle. The other to the energizing cycle. Well, what's the difference? Well, when you're listening to your wife to have understanding, you're listening trying to understand your wife. That's what you should be doing. If you're listening to be heard, this is what husbands often do. Okay, I'm going to fix that for you. Or, hey, this is what you should do. Do you hear me? And you're not really listening with concern. You're listening as Bob the builder, Bob the fixer. And we need to be careful of that. Are we listening to be heard? Do you listen to me? Or are we listening for understanding? James 1, 19 and 20. But let everyone be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Just yet another passage that says as a Christian, sometimes fewer words are more wise than many words. We have to communicate because the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8 and 9, if we're able to communicate better, if we're able to energize each other to do the tough stuff, then we are going to do what he says here. We are going to be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, humble in spirit. We're not going to return evil for evil, insult for insult, but we're going to be all about giving a blessing. And when that happens, we're not in the crazy cycle. We're in the energizing cycle. It's all about how you want that relationship to turn out. And as we close this morning, how do you want your relationship with God to continue? Are you good with the way it is? Great. But maybe there's one here this morning needs to work on that relationship, needs to bring it back together. You know how you do that? Kind of what Peter says. You do it with a humble spirit, a kind heart. You come to seek a blessing and give God a blessing. And the only way you can do all of that, not only by action, but by communicating that to God. And so if there's one here this morning that we as Christians can help you, maybe help you communicate to God. Maybe take those steps that bring you back to God. If we can help you do that, won't you come forward? Let that be known as together we stand.